Welcome, and thank you for joining us at the conversation. My name is Paul Grandal. I'm the director of the New York State Writers Institute at the University at Albany, and we are the promoters, the producers, the sponsors of the conversation. And before I introduce today's guest, Emily Layden, I want to mention that all of our author interviews are archived on our YouTube channel, and also you can find them on our website, nyswritersinstitute.org. We'd also welcome you to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And if you want to support future programming like this, you can go to our website, and we'd be grateful if you wanted to make a donation. Again, that's nyswritersinstitute.org. Now let me introduce our guest, Emily Layden. She grew up here in the Capital Region, graduated from Stanford University, and taught high school English at several girls' boarding schools around the country. She's returned to the Albany area recently and is pursuing her writing career full-time. Her nonfiction work has appeared in the New York Times, Marie Claire, The Billfold, and Runner's World. And she is also now a published fiction writer with her debut novel, All Girls, which will be released on February 16th by St. Martin's Press. It's generating strong early buzz as an engrossing coming-of-age story set in a New England girls' boarding school, spans one tumultuous year from orientation to commencement. An alumna's troubling allegation of sexual misconduct by a faculty member swirls around this year and creates great drama, both real and imagined. It's also already making several lists for recommended reading for the winter, including Town and Country's 28 must-read books of the winter, 2021. Also the most anticipated books of winter by Parade magazine, and Good Housekeeping named it one of the best books to read in 2021. That's high praise for any author, but all the more impressive for a first-time novelist. So it's a pleasure to welcome you to the conversation. Thank you, Emily. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
So tell us a little bit about your early writing career, because full disclosure, your father, Joe Layden, is a friend and colleague. He was the sports editor and a columnist of the Albany Times-Union, where I worked for many years. He's also an author of many books. And I remember when you were a young kid coming into the Times-Union newsroom. So was that exposure sort of lead to your interest in writing, particularly the kind of journalism and nonfiction work you did initially?
Yeah, so I grew up in a family of storytellers, right? It's actually not just my dad, but also, I'm sure you know, his brother, Tim Layden,
Yes.
who worked for Sports Illustrated for a long time and now is at NBC Sports. And my cousin, Kristen, Tim's daughter, is a television writer. And Kristen and I, when we were kids, we hung out all the time because the brothers are sort of inseparable. We would write plays and put them on for the family, and have really elaborate stories for our Barbies and our action figures. And all of that was, if not encouraged, tolerated, right? So that it's been, that's been my whole life. But I think as much as I grew up in a family of storytellers, I also grew up in a family of teachers, right? My mom is a teacher. My grandparents are teachers. My aunt and uncle are both teachers on the other side. And so in a way, this book is a little bit of a marriage of both of those worlds.
That's great. Now, when you went to Stanford, did you pursue a writing degree or English, or were you interested in journalism at any point? Or
actually, I was an American Studies major, which is like English and history together. And it happened in a fumbling way, which I think a lot of American Studies majors, which is how a lot of American Studies majors would describe their paths, right? I just took all of the classes that were interesting to me, and it ended up that it was an American Studies degree. But I actually, in my senior year at Stanford, for my honors thesis, I wrote a draft of a historical novel, because that's the kind of thing that American Studies allows, is this interdisciplinary sort of work. So I was definitely tremendously supported as a writer by both American Studies and the creative writing departments at Stanford.
Excellent. Now, I remember you were a standout high school athlete, if I remember. You went to Saratoga High School, and was your sport soccer or lacrosse?
I did play soccer, but lacrosse was the
Lacrosse.
sport that I played in college. Yeah.
So lacrosse. So Stanford, part of it was to be an athlete, a scholar athlete. How long did you play lacrosse?
Well, so I actually had a bit of a tough athletic career at Stanford. I had many sports injuries. So in that regard, it was not a super successful career. But I think that there's no better place to feel supported as an athlete than at a place like Stanford. And even being injured, I had tremendous care and just a tremendous coaching and a different kind of mindset, which is just still how to listen to your body and tend to your body, and just in this really disciplined way, I guess.
Right. So I know what you said when your father and brother Joe and Tim, inseparable, but both very competitive. I used to play basketball with them when they were both. We had this Times Union group that started. Are you competitive like that? Because writing is also a competitive field. You got a pretty high bar with your father, with your uncle. I didn't know your cousin, but do you feel competitive at all in this field?
I'm ferociously competitive. Yeah, the apple does not fall far from the tree in that regard. But the thing about being a writer, unlike in sports, although it's certainly true in sports sometimes, right, is that so much of publication is out of your control, right? There's just really there's nothing you can do about your reviews, or who's going to read your book, or what mood they're going to be in when they read your book, or whether you're going to be chosen for certain lists or clubs. It's all, once you write it, it's just out of your control.
Right.
Whereas as an athlete, right, I'm very used to that. Like, well, there's always something I can do. I can train harder. I can lift weights. I can incorporate yoga, whatever, right? There's just stuff you can constantly be doing. So it's been an adjustment as a hyper competitive person to feel like there's just so much of this is beyond and my control.
Great. Well, we're going to get to All Girls. I appreciate I got an advanced copy and I read it on the plane when I had a nice trip to go out to see my mother in the Northwest. So we'll talk about that in a minute, but I'm interested a little bit in your story. So many young writers think it's impossible, to get a major publisher to publish their novel. And I know so many are frustrated and either give up or never succeed. What was your story of getting this novel published? Obviously, you had some solid writing credits with national publications, but do you have that story where it was rejected 50 times, or was it immediately scooped up from your agent? What was your story?
I think somewhere in between. I went through the normal querying process. So I wrote a draft. I had a couple of beta readers. I did edits, and then I, emailed probably just shy of 20 agents, I think, and then more than half of them asked for, probably 2/3 asked for to see the full manuscript, and then I ended up with a handful of offers, and landed with the most wonderful agent in the entire world. And
who is your agent? Let's mention
Lisa Grubka at Fletcher & Co.
Okay.
And then she sold the book in 24 hours. So it was parts of that story are very normal, right? And that I wrote it, and then I did the process that is set out for a new writer, which is called the querying process. But then obviously the speed of the sale is not typical.
Right. Did you have, I mean, a lot of novelists have a lot of kind of starter novels that they've put into a drawer or deleted or thrown out. Had you actually finished a full novel manuscript before that didn't get published, or you didn't want to try to get it published? Or is this really your first at this length?
Well, I did write, as I mentioned at the top, I wrote that draft of a novel for my thesis at Stanford. And I did kick that around a little bit, sort of using some connections, because I was working in publishing at the time. I did show it to a few people in industry, and it just wasn't ready. And I also wasn't ready to sort of give it the work it needed to get it over the line. So that one is still around. I still have it in a file somewhere, but I'm not sure if I would ever go back to it.
So where did you work in publishing, and what did you do?
I worked at Marie Claire, a magazine, and I worked there for a year after I graduated from Stanford, just in fashion features. So, you know, I just read Joan Didion's new book, and she talks about her time at Vogue and how the very tight writing she had to do while she was there. It seems so silly, right? To be like, you know, writing 5-word headlines for spreads on, I don't know, Argyle sweaters, but like that writing being really economical, that taught her a lot that served her really well in her career. And I think that, and I certainly feel that way about that very small writing I did for a fashion magazine. I think it trained me really well.
Yeah, writing short really is harder than writing long in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
So Joan Didion's a pretty high bar. Who are some of your other literary heroes, you know, that you read a lot or that you look to for inspiration? Or
Yeah, I love Joan. But I mean, I reread Toni Morrison every year. I
what's
just
your
feel like
what's your favorite Toni Morrison novel?
Beloved. I love Beloved. I don't think I'll ever stop learning from that book. And I love Mary Oliver and Emily Dickinson too, in terms of poetry. I think that Mary Oliver feels very meditative to me, and Emily Dickinson is another writer whose poems keep revealing themselves to me. That, first of all, there are a million of them.
Right.
and also, you know, sometimes I have the experience with Dickinson of not understanding a poem and then coming back to it a year later and being like, oh, I get it now. And so that's kind of, I think, yeah, I just look to writers who I feel like I keep teaching me upon rereading.
So I always, you know, work with young writers and try to tell them you have to be a good reader before a good writer. I assume you believe in that. You started out as a great reader before you became a writer. Were you reading all through because of the influence of your parents and your family, or is it something you learned in college or after? Or?
Oh, we were huge readers growing up. Every, like, you know, 60% of pictures of me as a small child are like this with a book, right? I love books. And I think that it's really important not just to read the writers who came before you, but to read your peers too, to sort of understand what's working right now, where the conversation is, to kind of understand where it might be moving. And I think that it just, again, to use like the sports metaphor, right? Like, you watch game tape to understand plays, right? And I think you read also to understand, to learn new things about structure and style, and to just be swimming in the water you're supposed to be swimming in, I guess.
Right. I saw, St. Martin's is giving you a strong marketing campaign, and a lot of the material they reference J. Courtney Sullivan, who actually interviewed. She was at our book festival this fall.
For a new book.
Yeah, Friends
Yeah.
of Strangers. She's been very successful, but also Emma Klein, Curtis Sittenfield, I guess Sally Rooney. Is that the term chiclet? Again, this is not a genre I read in or know a lot. Is that pejorative or is that?
Yeah, I think we're not using it anymore.
Okay, that's what I thought.
I think we're using like women's fiction, which still sometimes is, there's they've done psychology studies on how like a little girl will pick up a book or a toy of any gender, but a little boy is much less likely to pick up a book that's about girls, for example. So there's just this way that as a culture we've othered women's writing. So it would be great if it was just like, oh, literary fiction, not necessarily like chiclet or women's fiction. But
I get it from marketing, because I've seen studies that 80% of the book buyers are women.
Mm-hmm.
When we have events, when we have things, our audience skews hugely majority women.
Yeah.
So I understand that. But so let's talk about All Girls. It's set at this Atwater school. Fictional, but it's kind of, I don't know, it's in that Connecticut sort of belt, that area of a lot of prep schools. And and I know the writing advice that every writer gets, write what you know. So when you're teaching at some of these schools, are you taking notes and thinking like, this is going to be great for my first novel? Or how did you pick this subject matter, for instance?
So I think that most of all, when I sat down to write this book, I really wanted to write something that, first of all, honored the experience of teenage girlhood. I wanted to show that in really all its depth and capacity. And then second, I wanted to try to do that through the lens of an all-girls school, because I thought it would be really interesting to try to write about what it must be like to come of age in a place that really promises you the world, right? These girls' schools make really big promises for empowerment and possibility and potential. But when that world really still isn't yours for the taking.
Right. So you never lived this. You didn't attend around here. It would be like Emma Willard School, but you did teach there, right? You taught at Emma Willard?
Yeah, I taught at Emma and a number of other girls' schools.
Right. So it wasn't something that lived experience, but you sort of saw it. So the main character is this Lauren Triplet. Feels like a little bit of you, and her sport happens to be soccer, but is there some of you in the protagonist, the main character in the story?
Well, I don't actually see Lauren. I don't see this book as having a protagonist. I see it as an ensemble cast. And I think in that way, of course, there's a little bit of me in all of the girls because I was a teenage girl. And so some of their observations and anxieties and worries and fears and hopes, those are things that I remember, but also things that I saw, right, in working with young women as their teacher and mentor. So no one is based on me, but of course they're informed by my own girlhood.
Okay, so I have a son and a daughter, and just in my experience as a parent, it seems like girls can be a lot meaner in a different kind of bullying. Boys are much head on, something physical and violent often. So these girls, you sort of get, there's some of them that skew towards the mean girls and the kind of whisper and online campaign. Then there's the strong kind of independent girls. And what's interesting, this is what I wonder how much influence the role of the newspaper in this school. The publication plays an important part of finding out the truth and demanding transparency and things. So you said you're a little bit of all of the characters. So do you think you or most girls have all those traits? They're not sort of black and white, this age group that you're writing, this teenage age group?
Yeah, I think that girls are really complex beings, right? And even that that the sort of the toxicity of some girl relationships that we see, I think that is, I think I was in some ways actually writing directly against that, which is just to say that certainly some of my characters are mean to one another. But I felt that we're so used to seeing that in the media, right? Like that's a very common depiction of young girls as mean and catty and superficial and bullying. And it's not that that's not true, but which is to say it's not that girls can't be that way. But I also think that they are capable of tremendous love and empathy and care. And so in this book, I really wanted to show that the girls are as whole as adults are, right? Like they're kids, they have undeveloped brains, but like they carry a range of experiences and emotions that they aren't often given credit for.
But there's also, they're at that age where they're trying to break away from their parents and become independent. The Karen, or Lauren rather, her mother's a helicopter parent and some of the others are too. What do you see the role that the parents are always kind of just out of the frame, but they're exerting different forces on this whole scene? And the fact that it is, a boarding school, not just a day school and things. What's your sense of how actually free or independent these girls who go away to school are, and how much are they playing out their parents' expectations and roles?
That's a great question. And I think it's something that as a teacher, so I think what's interesting about that question is that when I went to college, I met a ton of kids who had gone to boarding school, right? Like it was just like, there were a ton of prep school kids at Stanford.
Right.
And to me, they seemed so grown up. They seemed so much more like worldly and a little bit jaded than all the public school kids. And so I had this one understanding of what it is to be a prep school kid in my head. But then when I started teaching at these schools, and living in the dorms with them as a dorm parent, right? They're the person, they would knock on my door at 2 a.m. when they were sick with the flu, right? That experience totally reframed it for me. And I was like, oh, they are still kids. They're very much still children. And I do think that boarding school forces a certain, is a heightened experience or an accelerated experience in terms of growing up. But I don't think that, I think that what I've learned, which is what someone who maybe hasn't gone to boarding school or hasn't been steeped in these worlds might not know, is that they are just still children.
How about the both the tone and the style and the subject matter you put into this novel? I think it would have been easy to have gratuitous violence or sex like a lot of books do, but you don't. I would say it's a clean, it's a almost PG or PG-13. Was that intentional? No, I mean, I think it is. I didn't see
Yeah.
any just going for, sensationalistic with the
Mhm.
scenes, the abuse has happened before. You don't see it
Mhm.
in real time and things. But tell me
Mhm.
about the overall, tone you put on it.
Yeah, that's I love that you noticed that. I think that it's really sexy to write about girls and sex. And it wasn't that wasn't I wasn't like, I mean, there are obviously still some sex scenes in the book. I wasn't shying away from it, but when we talk about girls and sex, we're actually talking about so much more than the physical act of sex and the physicality of it. There is so much psychology at play, so much about how girls are thinking about their bodies, how they're thinking about where they are in relationship to their peers. They're thinking about how much power and agency they really have or don't have. So there was all of that stuff that is so much, not necessarily more interesting to me, but like is very interesting to me, rather than just a straight conversation about sex and rape, I guess, and consent.
Mhm. And then, the other character, as it were, is the administration, who are worried about their reputation,
Mm-hmm.
which is everything to these prep schools, and
Mm-hmm.
trying to kind of bury the story and keep it out of the public eye. Did you come across any of that in your own teaching experience from real life, or is that wholly invented?
So I think that working in these schools gave me a keen understanding of how they think and talk, right? And you see that talking in sort of those interstitials that the book has, and the way the head of school speaks. That stiff guardedness. I learned that, and that. So certainly working at schools coached me in in a school's attitude or reaction in a situation like the scandal that unfolds in the book.
So there is an actual, it's played out in the media in this area, from Emma Willard, an
Mm-hmm.
alumna, making a sexual
Mm-hmm.
misconduct, sexual abuse allegation. Did that figure it all into your shading of this, or were you writing it before that? That's come out fairly recently. I think it's still in the courts and legal process.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Um, it's funny. So when one of my favorite pieces of reader feedback so far has been when someone comes up to me and is like, "I know you wrote this about my school," and they're saying that they went to Ethel Walker, they went to Miss Porter's, they went to Foxcroft, right? Like and I think that what that tells me is two things, right? That I've managed to achieve kind of a universal but specific feeling in this book, which I think is kind of exactly my job as a writer. And I think the other unfortunate piece of this, right, is that when I was working on this book, it wasn't just Emma that was in the news. The Boston Globe, the Spotlight team had a literal drop-down menu of hundreds of prep schools that were currently facing massive abuse scandals. So it is, or has been, there has been a bit of a reckoning in the prep school world surrounding power and abuse.
It's interesting, though. They probably have more and higher priced lawyers because it hasn't got the attention that the Catholic Church, that the Boy Scouts, that some of these other organizations, they've managed to keep it out. Saw a couple, in New York City, the Spence School and others, but they haven't hit the news. And the Emma one here, that of course it was local, but I don't feel do you feel it's gotten the kind of glaring spotlight or exposure of other organizations with the same sorts of allegations?
Well, it's decentralized, right? Like the Catholic Church is one institution. It's much harder to take prep schools on the whole. There are thousands of them, right? Each with discrete patterns and behaviors and sins. And so I have to imagine that that's why, that it just is, it's sort of not just one institution. It sort of is, but it's also sort of not.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, there's certain things about the way you describe Atwater School that make me dislike it, make me kind of angry of this kind of institution that eating disorder certainly, and kind of the cliquishness of certain of the girl that you follow, are not accepted into the mainstream or whatever. And it seems often kind of exclusionary and kind of punitive for some of the kids that don't fit in certain ways. I guess after writing this and your experience in teaching, if one day you have a daughter, would you send her to an all-girls boarding school?
That's such an interesting question. You're right that the book is highly critical of institutions. But right, there's that line near the end of the novel when Bryce is looking out at the school, like after a night of sort of mayhem, and she says, she thinks something like, this is what it is to love a place. You have to want it to be better. And so the girls themselves, right, they do love their school. They have a lot of problems with it, and they wish that it listened to them, and they wish that they were granted more personhood, and they wish that they felt like they mattered more. But they also believe in the potential for their school to fulfill its founding legacy. And that, first of all, I think that's a really universal experience, whether we're talking about boarding schools or countries that we live in. But I think it's a really hopeful sentiment, and it is a hope that I found to be true and real at these schools. And so, yeah, I think if I did have a daughter, I would want to send her to a girls' school. Boarding, I don't know. That's like a different question. There's a different set of things there, but I in theory, believe in some of the promises of girls' school.
Now, the fact that you moved from different ones, and I don't think you're currently teaching at a prep school, are you? So was that strictly you were brought in an temp situation, or you didn't like the job, or what? Why did you move on or leave?
Oh yeah, no, normal life intervened, which is I met the man who's now my husband and bounced around a bit for his job, and I just found teaching jobs wherever he had to go.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So when you talked about sending out the manuscript to different readers, was one your dad, or did you send it to your uncle? No,
I did not. No. I think that I can't explain why, except for that maybe it just felt, I think that we're not always the best at receiving our parents' feedback. So it felt probably safer to not embark on that conversation.
And
Although I'm sure it would have been great feedback.
well, for your second one, so what's are you already starting a second? Is this like a 2-book deal? Is it something you want to stay in this, I guess you would call it a genre in a way, or what are your plans next?
Yeah, it's not a 2-book deal. But I am certainly working on a second novel. Still in the women's fiction genre, but not a boarding school book. And I'd say that I like to, I'm a little superstitious about talking about things, right? Talking about my art before it's, I guess I believe in like the creative cocoon. So I'll say that it's kind of a meditation on female power and ambition.
Mm-hmm. But fiction, it's not a memoir or a reported book. So what are your overall hopes for this, debut effort? Do you hope it mainly leads to a second book contract? Do you hope it gets picked up for a film? Do you hope it is required reading in every girls' boarding school in the country? What do you hope for?
I hope that the book can make space for a conversation about the legitimacy of the experience of girlhood and the power and capacity of teenage girls. That's what I hope it achieves at an artistic level. Yeah. But yeah, of course, I want to write more books.
I love the cover, this kind of tartan. Do you have a copy handy? Could you read a brief section, maybe the opening, or if you have a page or two that you like, the opening maybe? Yeah.
Sure. Yeah, I'll read right from the top, that sort of prologue that situates us, really in the time and place of the book. Mm-hmm. There are no major highways into the northwest corner of Connecticut that comprises Litchfield County. Travelers from the more densely populated suburbs of New York, from Westchester and Long Island, from Danbury and Greenwich, find themselves frustrated by the path of winnowing thoroughfares, turnpikes and interstates splitting again and again like capillaries from an artery. No matter the starting point, the final approach to Atwater requires navigating Litchfield's web of 2-lane county roads, flanked in most cases by farmland and medium-thick deciduous forest, the only signage suggesting lowered speeds around particularly treacherous curves. In this corner of New England, like the PCH in certain parts of Southern California, like the pavement that cuts between oil fields outside Odessa, these are the roads meant for windows down and music on loud. This is where teenagers wrap themselves around telephone poles. The vandal, if vandalism is what you wanted to call it, clearly knew this when she considered her options. Unlike the question of whether the act was vandalism, there was near unanimous agreement that the culprit was, in fact, a she. She clearly knew that families dropping their daughters off at school had their pick of county routes to zig and zag across, like ants to the nest. She might have also known that the nearest billboards were at the interchanges and highway overpasses near Waterbury and Hartford. She might have further estimated the number of students who drove that way and decided, not enough. When she placed her order with Vistaprint, the label was printed neatly on the back of each poster board. For 118 by 27-inch signs and 100 stands, it was with the understanding that the best approach was a scattershot one, shrapnel blasted across the entire county. She likely researched Connecticut laws and local ordinances regarding yard signs and public property and determined that what she was planning was probably not illegal, not exactly, but that it was best to plant the signs under the cover of darkness on a night as close to opening day as possible. And so when the residents of Kent and Goshen and Roxbury woke one morning in late August, the day the boarding school at the heart of their suburban rural community was set to open for the academic year, and made their way to the little main streets and intersections that held their corner stores and gas stations, they found their roads peppered with little black rectangles, low and squat and set 30 feet from the pavement. It wasn't until they passed 2 or 3 that the words coalesced into meaning, the R's and P's sorted and organized by a fogged morning brain. Longer still, it took to identify the purpose of these campaign signs in a non-election year. And so the phrasing of the placards planted like seeds in a 15-mile radius from the Atwater School settled confusedly onto the surrounding community. A rapist works here, they read, the message positioned next to a sepia-toned photo of a schoolhouse steeple, haloed in black like an antique portrait. They were gone almost as soon as they'd popped up, lingering only for a day or two, so that those that remained withered like mailbox balloons after a birthday party, wilted and random, more frequent the further you traveled from campus. They guessed the school came around and tore them up, or maybe it was their neighbors for whom the vulgarity of the signs was too much. Who wanted to look at that word every day? Who wanted to think about that kind of violence? Because of this, few of them had the chance to look up the URL that slugs the bottom of each sign, the one that might have directed them to a petition to extend Connecticut's statute of limitations on rape and sexual assault, a kind of activism that might have struck them as surprisingly reasonable given the shock of the headline and the tabloidishness of the signs. In time, the townspeople for whom Atwater was a kind of ivory tower would decide the words on the yard signs weren't meant for them, not really, and the act of vigilante justice would fade in their memories to a kind of sad and misguided prank. They were used to this kind of thing, the whispers of scandal that accompany the very, very privileged. It was never any of their business.
Thank you. That really sets the scene. A rapist works here is powerful, and that's the tension throughout these allegations, and it embroils the school, the alumni network, and the administrators and everything. It's a powerful debut novel. All Girls. Our guest, Emily Layden. Thanks so much for joining us on the conversation, Emily.
Thanks for having me.
It's be published February 16th. We will provide a link to order it online from our local independent bookseller, and it's a tremendous read. Thanks again, Emily.
Thank you.